People laughed the second he walked into the courtroom. Not loud at first. Just those little chuckles people think nobody hears, the kind that slip out when they've already decided who matters and who doesn't. A woman near the back leaned toward her husband and whispered something that made him grin. Across the aisle, the Academy's attorney adjusted his expensive watch and smirked as if the whole thing was already over. And standing there in the middle of it all was Samuel Parker, 61 years old, wearing the same faded maintenance uniform he'd worn almost every workday for the last 32 years. The navy blue shirt had been washed so many times the color barely matched the pants anymore, and his work boots carried scratches from decades of climbing ladders, fixing doors, and crawling through dusty utility spaces most people never even knew existed. Samuel noticed the looks. Of course he did. But after 3 decades of being invisible, he'd learned something most people never do. Sometimes silence is stronger than pride. The truth is, nobody at Cedar Ridge Academy ever paid much attention to Sam until they needed someone to blame. For 32 years, he was the first truck in the parking lot every morning. Teachers joked that the sun didn't rise until Sam unlocked the front doors. He knew every classroom, every light switch, every leaking faucet, every strange sound the old building made during winter storms. He knew which third-grade teacher always forgot her keys, which student secretly left sandwiches in his locker for the stray cat behind the gym, and which hallway floor squeaked no matter how many times he repaired it. Most people saw a maintenance man. Sam saw a second home. That's why the whole thing hurt so much. It started with a pipe. Nothing dramatic at first. Just a small leak inside the lower administration wing. Sam found it during a routine inspection nearly 3 weeks before the disaster. He filed the report the same day. Then another one 4 days later when the leak got worse. Then a third report after discovering water stains spreading behind the walls. Every form was submitted properly. Every warning followed protocol. Every recommendation was ignored. The school had a new administration team then, led by Headmaster Gregory Vance, a polished man with perfect hair, expensive suits, and a talent for making every conversation feel like a business transaction. Vance had been hired to modernize Cedar Ridge. What that really meant was cutting costs while smiling about it. Whenever Sam mentioned repairs, Vance would nod politely and say things like, "Let's revisit that next quarter," or "We're prioritizing strategic investments right now." Strategic investments apparently meant a new athletic center, a redesigned donor lounge, and a 6-figure branding campaign. Replacing aging pipes never made the list. 3 days before everything fell apart, Sam personally stopped Assistant Headmaster Linda Mercer outside the faculty office. "Linda, that leak's getting dangerous," he told her. "I'm serious. If that line bursts, it's going to cause real damage." She sighed without looking up from her tablet. "I'll forward it again. You said that last week, and I'll say it again this week." Then she walked away. Sam stood there for a moment staring after her. Something in his gut told him trouble was coming. The problem was, he had no authority to force anyone to listen. Then came the storm. A heavy spring rain rolled through northern Pennsylvania overnight. Around 2 in the morning, one of the aging pressure lines finally failed. Thousands of gallons of water poured into the lower level of the academy. Computer labs flooded. Archived records were destroyed. Expensive equipment sat underwater before anyone even knew what happened. By sunrise, the place looked like a disaster zone. Parents were furious. Local reporters showed up before lunch. Donors started asking questions. And inside a closed-door emergency meeting, school administrators faced a problem bigger than the flood itself. Somebody was going to have to take the fall. A week later, Sam was called into Human Resources. He expected questions, maybe paperwork. Instead, he was handed a termination letter. He read it twice because he honestly thought there had been some mistake. Negligence. Failure to perform duties. Contributing to property damage. 32 years of service reduced to 3 lines of legal language. "You've got to be kidding me," Sam said quietly. The HR director couldn't even meet his eyes. "This decision came from the board. You know I reported that leak." Silence. "You know I reported it 3 times. More silence. That's when Sam realized something that chilled him more than losing his job. They weren't accusing him because they believed he was guilty. They were accusing him because they believed nobody would care if he was. For the first few days after losing his job, Sam Parker barely left the house. Every morning his body still woke up at 4:30 out of habit, and for a few seconds he'd forget what had happened. Then reality would settle in all over again. No keys to collect. No hallways to unlock. No classrooms waiting for him. Just silence. His wife, Eleanor, watched him drift through the kitchen with a coffee mug in his hands and a 1,000-yard stare in his eyes. They had never been wealthy. Sam's paycheck had always been modest, but it had been steady, dependable, something they built their life around. Now even that was gone. One evening, Eleanor sat across from him at the dinner table and finally asked the question neither of them wanted to say out loud. "Are you going to fight this?" Sam stared at his plate for a long moment. "How?" he said. "They've got lawyers. They've got money. They've got an entire board backing them." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Maybe, but you've got the truth." Sam almost laughed. The truth sounded nice in speeches and movies. Real life was different. Real life usually favored whoever could afford the better attorney. But over the following weeks, something unexpected started happening. People began reaching out. The first was a science teacher named Rachel Monroe. She knocked on the Parker family's front door, carrying a folder thick enough to stop a bullet. "I think these belong to you," she said. Inside were copies of maintenance requests, email chains, and internal memos she had quietly saved over the years. Sam flipped through them and felt his pulse quicken. There it was. The first leak report, then the second, then a follow-up request. All time-stamped, all documented, all ignored. Rachel crossed her arms. "Everyone knows what happened. Then why isn't anyone saying anything?" Sam asked. Rachel gave a sad smile. "Because people are scared of losing their jobs." A few days later, another teacher called. Then another. A retired office administrator reached out. A former maintenance worker offered to testify about repeated budget cuts to critical infrastructure repairs. Piece by piece, a different story started emerging. The flood wasn't an accident nobody could have predicted. It was the result of years of neglect hidden behind expensive marketing campaigns and polished public relations. Then came the conversation that changed everything. A former board accountant named Harold Jensen contacted Sam and asked to meet at a small diner outside town. Harold looked nervous from the moment he sat down. He kept glancing toward the windows like someone might be watching. Finally, he slid a manila envelope across the table. "You didn't get this from me." Sam opened it. Inside were budget reports and board meeting summaries. As he read, his stomach tightened. Months before the flood, administrators had been warned that the lower-level plumbing system was nearing failure. Independent inspectors had recommended immediate replacement. The projected cost was expensive, but manageable. Instead, the board postponed repairs and redirected the funds toward a new donor relations center designed to attract wealthy families. Sam looked up. They knew. Harold nodded. Every one of them. And they did nothing? Harold leaned back. Doing nothing would have been bad enough. They actively chose appearance over safety. That night, Sam sat alone in his garage reading every page under a hanging work light. Anger wasn't what he felt. Anger would have been easier. What he felt was disappointment. For 3 decades, he believed Cedar Ridge Academy stood for something larger than money. He believed the speeches about community, integrity, and responsibility. Now he was staring at proof that those words had become little more than decorations on brochures. The lawsuit came shortly afterward. Not from Sam. From the school. They were suing him personally for damages tied to the flood. The number was so large it looked unreal on paper. More money than he could earn in several lifetimes. When the notice arrived, Eleanor stared at it and whispered, "They're trying to bury you." Sam nodded. "No," he said quietly. "They're trying to scare me." The strange thing was, once you've already lost everything important, fear starts losing its power. Instead of backing down, Sam filed a counterclaim for wrongful termination and defamation. He couldn't afford a high-powered legal team, so he spent hours at the public library reading case law, learning procedures, organizing evidence. The librarians got used to seeing him every day. Sometimes students would walk past and recognize him. One young man stopped and said, "Mr. Parker, you fixed my wheelchair ramp sophomore year." Sam smiled. Glad it held together. The student shook his head. "You always help people." Little moments like that kept him going. Months passed. The closer the trial got, the uglier things became. Anonymous comments appeared online accusing Sam of incompetence. Rumors spread that he had ignored safety inspections. Someone even claimed he'd been sleeping during work hours. Most of the stories were ridiculous, but repetition has a way of making lies sound believable. One afternoon, Sam ran into Gregory Vance at a grocery store. The headmaster spotted him near the produce section and walked over wearing the same confident smile he'd always used during fundraising events. Sam, Gregory, still planning to go through with this? Vance asked. Sam set a bag of apples into his cart, planning to tell the truth. Vance chuckled softly. Truth is a complicated thing. Not really. The smile faded slightly. You know, this could all end quietly. There are ways to resolve matters without creating unnecessary attention. Sam looked directly into his eyes. You mean settle? I'm saying public fights rarely help anyone. Funny, Sam replied. Because none of this became public until you blamed me. For the first time, Vance looked irritated. You're making a mistake. Sam shrugged. Maybe, but it'll be my mistake. Then he pushed his cart away and left the headmaster standing alone beside the oranges. By the time the court date arrived, Sam had accumulated boxes of evidence. 3 maintenance reports, email records, witness statements, budget documents, internal correspondence, inspection findings. What surprised him most wasn't how much evidence existed. It was how many people had quietly kept copies because they suspected something like this might happen someday. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Eleanor helped straighten the collar on his faded work shirt. You sure you don't want to wear the suit? She asked. Sam glanced toward the closet. The suit was old and barely fit anymore. He shook his head. This is who I am. Eleanor smiled softly. Then that's exactly what you should wear. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Reporters lined the hallway. Parents from Cedar Ridge filled the benches. Teachers sat together near the back. Sam noticed several former students as well. Some were adults now with careers and families of their own. Somehow they had heard about the case. Across the room sat Gregory Vance, Assistant Headmaster Mercer, and several board members dressed like they were attending a corporate conference instead of a legal proceeding. Their attorney looked completely relaxed. As people filed into the courtroom, whispers followed Sam everywhere he went. Some sympathetic, some mocking, some simply curious. He could feel dozens of eyes studying his uniform. Then the attorney stood and made a show of organizing thick binders across the table. He glanced at Sam and smiled the way a man smiles when he believes victory is guaranteed. What none of them realized was that inside a worn cardboard box beside Sam's chair sat the documents that would soon change the entire direction of the case. And within the next hour, a judge named Rebecca Holloway was about to ask one simple question that nobody on the school's side was prepared to answer. Judge Rebecca Holloway entered the courtroom with the kind of presence that instantly quieted a room. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't dramatic. But she carried herself like someone who had spent years listening to people bend the truth and had developed very little patience for it. The moment everyone was seated, the school's attorney stood and launched into his argument. He spoke confidently, pacing in front of the jury box, describing Sam Parker as a well-meaning employee who had unfortunately failed in his responsibilities. He talked about procedures, liability, and damages. He used polished language and expensive-sounding phrases. At one point, he even gestured toward Sam and said, "While we appreciate Mr. Parker's years of service, good intentions do not excuse negligence." A few people nodded. Others stared straight ahead. Then the attorney delivered the line he clearly thought would end the case. "Your Honor, Mr. Parker has no professional engineering credentials, no advanced education in facilities management, and no evidence proving the administration ignored his concerns." The courtroom became still. Judge Holloway lowered her glasses and looked down at the file in front of her. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked back up. "No evidence?" she asked calmly. The attorney's confidence faltered for the first time. "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge turned a page. "That's interesting. Another page. Because according to these records, Mr. Parker submitted 3 separate maintenance reports warning of the exact failure that eventually occurred." Silence. The attorney blinked. Judge Holloway continued. "All 3 reports appear to have been received by school administration." Another page turned. "And unless I'm misunderstanding this document." Assistant Headmaster Mercer acknowledged one of those warnings in writing the day before the flood. The room seemed to lose all sound at once. Gregory Vance shifted in his seat. Mercer stared at the table. The attorney suddenly looked less certain of himself. Then the judge began reviewing witness statements. 5 teachers, a retired administrator, a former maintenance employee, a student who personally witnessed Sam warning school officials about the worsening leak. One after another, The narrative the school had spent months constructing began falling apart. The attorney attempted to object several times, but every objection seemed weaker than the last. Finally, Judge Holloway looked toward Sam. "Mr. Parker, please stand." Sam rose slowly. His hands were steady now, not because he wasn't nervous, but because something inside him had finally settled. The truth was no longer buried. "Mr. Parker," the judge said, "after reviewing these records, it appears you made repeated efforts to prevent this incident. Why did you continue reporting the problem when your warnings were ignored?" Sam cleared his throat. Every eye in the courtroom was on him. Reporters paused their typing. Teachers leaned forward. Even the board members looked up. "Because kids were in that building," he said simply. "That's it?" the judge asked. Sam nodded. "That's it. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I wasn't trying to make anyone look bad. I just didn't want somebody getting hurt." You could feel the atmosphere shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough for people to stop seeing a maintenance worker and start seeing a human being. Judge Holloway turned toward the school representatives. The disappointment in her expression was impossible to miss. "This court finds substantial evidence that Mr. Parker fulfilled his responsibilities and repeatedly warned the administration about a known hazard. The evidence further suggests those warnings were disregarded." Gregory Vance looked as though someone had punched all the air out of his lungs. The judge continued. "The termination of Mr. Parker appears retaliatory, unsupported by facts, and deeply damaging to his professional reputation." Then came the ruling. Wrongful termination, defamation, full reinstatement if he chose to return, back pay, financial damages, legal costs. The attorney closed his eyes. Mercer looked ready to disappear into her chair. Several parents exchanged stunned looks. But Judge Holloway wasn't finished. She leaned forward and delivered the line people would talk about for months afterward. "There is a difference between leadership and status. One is earned through service. The other can be purchased with a title. Based on the evidence presented today, Mr. Parker demonstrated more leadership than anyone responsible for dismissing him." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For the first time all day, the room belonged entirely to Sam. As people began filing out after the hearing, reporters rushed toward the exits, chasing statements and reactions. Teachers gathered around Sam. Former students shook his hand. One of them even laughed and said, "Guess they picked the wrong guy to blame." Sam smiled for what felt like the first time in months. Then, just as the crowd began thinning, a young woman approached him quietly. She looked to be about 19. She wore a simple green scarf and held herself with the nervous determination of someone trying not to lose courage. "Mr. Parker?" she asked. Sam turned. "Yes. I don't know if you remember me." He studied her face for a moment and shook his head apologetically. The young woman smiled. "That's okay. You probably wouldn't. But 3 years ago my mother was recovering from cancer treatment at St. Mary's Hospital." Sam's expression changed immediately. He still worked part-time evenings at the hospital back then. "Your mom's name wasn't Karen, was it?" The young woman's eyes widened. "You remember?" Sam nodded slowly. "She always asked about my wife's soup recipes." The young woman laughed through sudden tears. "Yeah, that's her." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she took a breath. "My mom passed away last year." Sam lowered his head. "I'm sorry. Before she died, she told me something. She said if I ever saw you again, I had to thank you." Sam looked confused. "For what?" The young woman smiled. "You used to leave soup for her on the nights she couldn't eat. You'd sit for a few minutes after your shift and talk with her when nobody else had time." Sam's eyes glistened. He had almost forgotten those evenings. To him, they had felt small, ordinary, human. "She said you made her feel visible when she was scared." The young woman wiped her eyes. "My mom always said some people wear suits to impress others, but the best people wear work boots because they're too busy helping to worry about being important." Sam removed his old cap and held it against his chest. For a moment, the noise of the courthouse seemed to disappear. Then he smiled and quietly said, "Your mother helped me more than she ever knew." The young woman nodded and walked away. Later that evening, after the cameras were gone and the headlines had started spreading across town, Sam sat on his front porch watching the sunset sink behind the trees. The court had ruled in his favor. His name had been cleared. Justice, at least legally, had won. But the question that stayed with him wasn't whether the school board had been punished enough. It was something much simpler. How many good people get blamed every day because they're easy targets? How many voices get ignored because they don't come wrapped in titles, degrees, or expensive clothes? Maybe that's why this story still sparks debate whenever people hear it. Some say the school leaders got exactly what they deserve. Others argue mistakes happen and nobody should lose a career over one terrible decision. So what do you think? Was the court right? Did justice finally catch up with the people responsible? Or was the punishment too severe? Let us know in the comments below, because stories like this always reveal more about us than the people in them. And if you've ever seen an ordinary person stand up against powerful people and win, don't forget to share your story, subscribe to the channel, and join us for the next one.